The American Constitution of 1787 is one of the most remarkable documents of modern politics. The Constitution announced a new era of modern history, in which nation-states expressed their sovereignty by creating a formal, public set of rules for politics. All political entities have had constitutions, in the sense that they had recognized rules for politics. But the modern era is unique in its proliferation of written constitutions that explicitly define and restrain the legitimate powers of government. Indeed, constitutionalism has developed in tandem with democratization, as newly empowered governing majorities felt compelled to articulate and define the new political powers they exercised. But while most modern democracies are used to a fair amount of constitutional change to reflect shifts in political reality, the American Constitution has been rarely changed or amended. Since 1787, the Constitution has been amended 27 times. 10 of those amendments, which we call the Bill of Rights, were passed at once in 1791. Because the American Constitution was among the very first of its kind, and because it has been so rarely amended, it is a strikingly conservative and old-fashioned document, even as it governs an exuberantly modern and dynamic country. Consider the parallel case of France. The United States and France are the political pioneers of modernity. In the same year that the Constitution was ratified, 1789, the French Revolution began. Taken together, the revolutions in America and France announced the birth of modern politics. But while Americans still live under their 1787 Constitution, the Constitution of the present French Fifth Republic was written in 1958. In fact, since 1789, the French have lived under 5 republics, 2 empires, a revolutionary commune, a fascist puppet state, and repeated foreign occupations. Each had their own constitution. While the French case is extreme, it nevertheless underscores how unusual our Constitution is in the modern world. Modern constitutions have the advantage of learning from past mistakes. Institutions and forms of power that have proven unwieldy or unstable have tended to be disposed of, while proven and durable institutions proliferate. Certainly, newer constitutions have flaws and blind spots, but they do represent the application of experience. But the American Constitution's resistance to formal change means that it features a number of institutions that are comparatively rare in modern democracies. Unlike virtually every other peer country, the 21st century United States is governed by a system that is fundamentally a product of the 18th century. There are a lot of contributing factors to this state of affairs. Here I want to highlight just a couple. First, the Constitution is extremely hard to amend, and the coalitions needed to secure an amendment can only rarely be sustained for as long as is necessary. It is not a coincidence that the most profound changes to the Constitution have occurred in response to severe national crises. Second, the Constitution rewards those groups and actors that most effectively manipulate its structures. As the bulwark of the status quo, it has proven very effective in resisting change from outside the system. Third, the American Constitution is venerated as the central, unifying symbol of the Republic. Presidents, judges, senators, and soldiers all swear to uphold and defend the Constitution. The unifying principle of the United States is not a language, or a religion, or an ethnic group, or even a homeland. It is a legal document that outlines a framework for governing a federal union of states. In one sense, this is marvelous. At crucial moments in American history, the revolutionary development of democracy and equality have been guaranteed by a popular devotion to the idea of the Constitution. But in another sense, this veneration can be crippling. When a legal document becomes invested with the symbolic hopes and aspirations of an entire country, the very idea of altering it can be interpreted as an attack on the country's integrity. In our time, the Constitution as an ideal exists uneasily along with the unavoidable fact that our constitutional government is presently trapped in gridlock. The suspicions of centralized power that haunted the Constitution's authors in 1787 yielded a system that makes it very hard for lawmakers to act decisively. Under the Constitution, it is far easier to stop something from happening than to make something happen. As has been the case in earlier American history, modern politicians have found that their short-term interests are better served by halting legislation than encouraging it. One result of this recurring tendency has been a long-term shift in power from Congress to the President, who is in some ways less restrained. Now, take note of this. Because the framers of the Constitution had their reasons for fearing a too powerful legislature, they made it hard for Congress to become too powerful. But over time, as demands for all kinds of government action increased, power began to accrue to presidents willing to use their freer hand in order to satisfy all sorts of constituencies. Without having intended to do so, the Constitution tended toward a concentration of power in the hands of the president. So I want to emphasize the importance of structure here. Very often, things happen in American politics that we tend to attribute to the desires or the interests of specific politicians. And while it's absolutely true that individuals do matter, what matters just as much are the rules of the political game that constrain those politicians' actions. Even the most personally talented politicians have found themselves overmatched by the restraints of a constitutional system that frustrates the desire for swift action. While we cannot get into all of the details of the creation of the Constitution here, a few key facts must be kept in mind. When the 55 delegates of the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in 1787, the United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation. Drafted by the Revolutionary Congress during the War of Independence, the Articles amounted to a kind of military alliance among 13 independent states. These states cooperated on some key matters of war and peace, but it did not even have the power to compel a state to obey a treaty concluded between Congress and a foreign power. The Congress could not impose taxes to fund itself, regulate economic activity, or even sustain a justice system across the states. In the aftermath of war and independence, the country endured a severe economic crisis, as war debts froze credit and burdened small producers. State-issued paper money became worthless under spiraling inflation, and trade was paralyzed. The country no longer had an army. The Continental forces that had won the war against Britain, having gone unpaid for years, mutinied against Congress and were promptly disbanded. Most worrying for the merchant and planter elites, the radical democratic currents of the revolution were finding expression in many state governments, where coalitions of farmers and mechanics challenged the old elite's supposed right to rule. And in Massachusetts, impoverished farmers led by Daniel Shays rose in revolt against a state government that allowed creditors to foreclose on family farms. The future seemed to portend civil war, foreign intervention, and the loss of independence. It was in this context that the network of American elites that had led the revolution promoted a convention to renew and amend the Articles of Confederation. All of the states appointed delegates to this convention, which met in secret and disregarded its mandate in order to create an entirely new constitution for a federal government among the states. We should keep in mind that our revered Constitution was itself the product of an illegal assembly. We may well speak of the framers' coup, which replaced one government with another in an extra-legal process. We should also keep in mind that any survey of the Constitutional Convention makes it clear that the Constitution was a product of compromise and contingency. The delegates' goal was to create a federal union capable of coping with the country's problems, but this could only work if all of the states, with their diverse and contradictory interests, cooperated. This fact required steep and complex compromises over the tensions between big and small states, trading states and farming states, and free states and slave states. Moreover, the 55 delegates were exclusively members of the country's elite, primarily big merchants and planters, powerful gentry, and lawyers. Most were veterans of the Revolution as soldiers and politicians, and all shared some basic interests. Northern merchants and southern planters were equally concerned about global trade and export markets. Delegates from small states and large states were equally worried about the threat posed to their social positions by the development of democracy. Taken together, the authors of the Constitution operated under three key restraints, which shaped the possible forms the Constitution could take. First, they were compelled to create a republican form of government, not a monarchy. In fact, only Alexander Hamilton proposed creating an American monarchy. This did not make it into the musical. In practice, this meant that the Constitution had to include a system of representation, in which a big or small electorate elected men to represent them and make laws on their behalf. Second, a massive surge in westward settlement made it inevitable that new states would be created and join the Union. Since this was an inevitable development that was unpredictable in detail, the system needed to be flexible enough to deal with a variety of scenarios regarding new states. Third, entrenched interests like slavery and elite social domination could not be wished away and had to be incorporated into the Constitution if it was to have any hope of going into effect. This intricate mix of interests and necessities produced a compromise document that was only narrowly approved by the 9 states needed for it to take effect. Within a few years, many of the Constitution's authors had departed from the Convention's principles by organizing political parties to compete for power. In 1797, President John Adams and his Federalist allies in Congress passed a sedition law that made it a crime to criticize the government in print or speech, a direct violation of the First Amendment. The 1800 election, the fourth held under the Constitution, devolved into chaos as the rules of the Electoral College proved unable to cope with events. The very authors of the Constitution recognized, just 13 years later, that fundamental aspects of their system were seriously flawed. And of course, most notably, the nightmare of the Civil War was itself a product of the breakdown of the Constitution. The 1787 accommodations that embedded slavery in the Constitution came back with a vengeance in the crises of the 1840s and 1850s, while its mechanisms for compromise were exploited by short-sighted politicians who made open warfare unavoidable. So we must try to think of the Constitution as an historical artifact, a product of compromise that has been modified by further compromise. And the sum total of those compromises are what ultimately compose the federal government of 2020. Now, like any modern constitution, the US Constitution does a few basic things. First, it restrains power by defining what the federal government can and cannot do. Second, it authorizes the use of power by defining who can and cannot wield it and under what circumstances. Third, it is non-arbitrary. It lays out the rules that must be followed by those who wish to exercise power legitimately. The Constitution is really quite short and establishes the framework for the federal government with a minimum of words. As such, each word has been interpreted and reinterpreted many times, and those interpretations make up much of the body of law that regulate the functioning of a government that is vastly larger than it was in 1787. This means that while we must examine the Constitution in close detail, we have to keep in mind that it is only the foundation of a massive and sprawling structure of law and government that we call the United States of America.